I opened a dusty wooden box in my old classroom, and inside was a letter addressed to me, written 10 years before I was even born. And the moment I saw the date, I knew something about my past was never what I thought. I found the letter on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, the kind where the clouds drag their feet across the sky, and the whole world feels muted. I had returned to my old high school to drop off borrowed books for a volunteer project, but nostalgia pulled me deeper into the building than I intended to go. The halls felt smaller now, quieter than the years I once lived inside them. My shoes echoed as I passed the familiar murals, the ones Mrs. Alden used to praise during class discussions. Mrs. Alden, my old English teacher. She had been the first adult who ever really saw me. Not just my grades, not just my behavior, me. Her classroom door was open. Inside, boxes were stacked like chapters waiting to be closed. A custodian told me she'd finally retired after a health scare. The word hit me harder than expected. She had been a steady presence in my life, one of the good ones. Drawn by something I couldn't explain, I stepped inside. The room smelled like old books and chalk dust. Sunlight slipped through the blinds in thin, tired lines. On her desk sat a small wooden box with the initials MA carved into the lid. It looked personal, keepsake personal. I shouldn't have opened it. But I did. Inside were sealed letters, each with a former student's name written in her graceful handwriting. Some names made me smile. Others brought back memories I hadn't touched in years. Then I saw my name. But the date, May 4th, 2008, made my stomach drop. I wasn't born until 2018. My pulse kicked up. My breath thinned. Why would my teacher write a letter to someone who didn't exist yet? And how could she possibly know my name? With shaking fingers, I opened the envelope. At the top, in her familiar looping handwriting, it read, "For the student I'll one day meet." I stared at those words for a long moment, my mind stumbling over possibilities that didn't make sense. The edges of the paper were slightly yellowed, like it had been waiting, patiently, quietly, for me to find it. I sank into one of the old student desks, the same kind I'd once tapped my pencil on during her lectures, and let the room draw its slow breath around me. The letter began softly. "If you are reading this, then fate kept its promise." Fate? I frowned. "You won't know me in the way I know you," she wrote, "but I've spent years preparing for your arrival. You are the reason I stayed in this profession." The reason? I had a dozen questions and not a single answer. My childhood hadn't been extraordinary, at least, not on the surface. My parents were loving, hard-working people. My life was full of normal moments, scraped knees, birthday candles, quiet dinners. So why would my teacher write to me before my life even began? The next lines made my breath catch. "I met someone a long time ago, someone who told me about a child they hoped would change everything. A child who would carry a story that needed protecting. A child. A story. Protecting." It didn't sound like something a teacher would normally write. It sounded like something private, intimate. And suddenly I wondered whether my parents knew Mrs. Alden long before she ever stood at the front of my classroom. I kept reading. "If I never have the chance to guide you in person, I want you to know this: your voice will matter more than you think. You'll carry truths others are too afraid to speak." I swallowed hard. Growing up, Mrs. Alden had always encouraged me to write. She said my stories carried a kind of weight, a pull toward something deeper. But how could she have known that a decade before I existed? My eyes drifted toward the boxes surrounding her desk. Somewhere in these dusty stacks were answers, or at least enough threads to braid together the start of one. But the letter wasn't finished. "When the time comes, you will find something else I left behind. Trust what it shows you. And trust yourself." I read the letter twice, then a third time. Every sentence felt like it held another shadow, another secret. The room hummed with the weight of it. And then, at the very bottom of the page, written in smaller, shakier handwriting, almost like an afterthought, was a final line. Forgive me for what I couldn't tell you sooner. A chill slid down my spine. What hadn't she told me? And what was I supposed to forgive? When I looked up, the classroom felt different, like it was waiting for me to take the next step. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. I read that final line over and over, letting the words sink in like water into dry soil. Something about it felt unfinished. Like Mrs. Alden had wanted to reveal more but couldn't either because she didn't have time or she wasn't allowed to. Allowed. Why did that word even cross my mind? I folded the letter back into its envelope, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The air in the classroom felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for me to notice something I had missed. That's when I saw it. Behind her desk, half hidden under a stack of old yearbooks, was a thin, leather-bound notebook. The cover was worn, corners bent, as though it had been opened 1,000 times. I reached for it, brushing off a thin layer of dust. On the first page, written in her unmistakable cursive, were the words, "Notes for the child who will understand." My chest tightened. The child. Me. I flipped through the pages slowly. Most were filled with observations, moments she'd noticed in her students, encouraging notes to herself, reflections about teaching. But then, halfway through the notebook, her tone changed. The entries grew more personal, more guarded. Met with them again today. They're certain the child will come. They say the timeline is fixed. Them? Timeline? This was sounding less like a teacher's journal and more like something out of a mystery novel. Another entry. They asked if I would watch over the child. I said yes. I didn't hesitate. How could I? Their story, their fear, it stayed with me. I paused. Whoever they were, she trusted them enough to promise she'd look after someone who didn't even exist yet. I turned the page. If things don't go as planned, I must leave the child a way to understand. A letter won't be enough, but it's all I may have. My pulse thudded in my ears. Whatever she had been preparing for, it was big. Bigger than anything I'd ever imagined. At the bottom of the page, in smaller handwriting, like she'd written it in a hurry, was a warning. If you are reading this, the truth is already in motion. Go to the place where my story began. That is where yours will unfold. I stared at those words until they blurred. The place where her story began? Was she talking about her childhood home? Her first school? Where she grew up? Before I could make sense of any of it, the custodian's voice echoed from the hallway. Hey, closing up in 5 minutes. I startled. The notebook felt suddenly fragile in my hands, as if it held more than ink and memory, maybe even the key to a secret she'd guarded her entire life. I slipped both the letter and the notebook into my bag. Whatever this was, whatever she wanted me to find. I couldn't walk away from it now. The words echoed in my mind all the way home. I barely noticed the drive, barely noticed the soft drizzle that blurred the world outside my windshield. All I could think about was the notebook resting in my bag, a piece of my teacher's life that somehow pointed to mine. The moment I stepped into my room, I spread everything out on the bed, the letter, the worn notebook, and my own swirling confusion. I read the entries again, hoping the second pass would make things clearer. It didn't. If anything, it made one thing painfully obvious. Mrs. Alden had been preparing for me long before she ever met me. And she wasn't just writing hopeful, inspirational teacher stuff. She was preparing for something specific. I flipped to the back of the notebook, searching for clues. There were dates, old ones, stacked in the margins. And then I saw it, a single underlined phrase written years earlier. Brookside House. Under it, she had scribbled. Where I learned to listen. Where everything started. Brookside House. I'd never heard her mention it, not in class, not in passing, not even once. If it meant so much to her, why keep it hidden? I Googled it. After a few searches, something popped up, a small, faded photograph of a worn-out building with cracked bricks and a drooping roofline. A caption read, "Brookside House Orphanage, closed in 1999. An orphanage. My breath caught. Mrs. Alden had always carried a softness, a kind of empathetic precision. She always noticed when someone's shoulders sank, when someone's smile dimmed just a little. I used to wonder how she learned to read people so well. Maybe this was why. But that didn't explain the letter written a decade before I was born. Or the cryptic lines. Or the feeling that all of this was bigger than her childhood. I scrolled further until I found an address. It wasn't far, maybe an hour's drive out of town, tucked between quiet roads and old trees. My phone buzzed. A text from my mom. "Home by dinner? We're ordering pizza." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. I could lie, say I had homework or plans. But part of me knew this wasn't something to keep secret, not yet. Still, I typed back. "Yeah. Be home soon." But I didn't go home. Instead, I found myself grabbing my keys again, heart thudding with a mix of fear and certainty. The kind of certainty you feel in your bones, the kind you don't choose, you just follow. Before I walked out the door, I read one more line from the notebook. "If you find this place, you'll understand who you are." A chill went through me. Because I had never questioned who I was. Not until now. The drive to Brookside House felt longer than it was. The sky dimmed into a soft gray, the kind that makes everything look a little older, a little more worn. My GPS kept losing signal as the roads narrowed, twisting deeper into quiet countryside. Trees leaned toward the road like they were guarding something ancient. Finally, after a bend in the road, I saw it. Brookside House. The orphanage sat on a small hill like an abandoned memory, its once red bricks now washed into dull brown, windows boarded up, the roofline slanted as if the building was tired from holding too many stories. A rusted metal sign hung crookedly near the gate, the letters barely visible. I parked a few yards away and stepped out. The air felt colder here. Still. Like the world paused at the edges of the property. With each step toward the entrance, the notebook's words echoed in my mind. Where I learned to listen. Where everything started. Where the child's story will return. A piece of the fence had collapsed, giving me enough space to slip through. Inside the yard, patches of overgrown grass brushed against my legs. A few old toys, sun-bleached plastic blocks, a deflated ball, lay scattered, untouched for decades. They felt frozen in place, like relics of a time no one wanted to forget but everyone tried to. I reached the front door. It hung slightly open. My stomach twisted. I pushed it gently. It groaned in protest. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood. Broken floorboards creaked beneath my shoes. Sunlight filtered through the cracks in the boarded windows, striping the hallway in crooked lines of gold. The silence was thick, like the walls were full of unspoken stories. I followed the narrow hallway, guided by nothing more than intuition and the pull of the notebook tucked in my jacket pocket. Halfway down, I noticed a framed picture lying face down on the floor. I picked it up, brushing off the dust. A group photo. Children lined up, maybe 20 of them, with 2 adults standing behind them. One of the adults was unmistakably young Mrs. Alden. She looked different, softer around the edges, her smile smaller, more cautious. But her eyes were the same, watchful, understanding, quietly heavy. But something else caught my attention. In the bottom right corner of the group, half hidden by glare, sat a little boy holding a folded piece of paper. My chest tightened. Because the name written under him was one I recognized, but not from school, not from my neighborhood, not from any part of my normal life. It was from the letter. The letter written before I was born. Evan. The same name she used in the letter's hidden date note. A name I had skipped over, thinking it was part of another story. But now it felt important, urgent. Who was Evan? And why did Mrs. Alden believe his story had something to do with mine? A soft draft moved through the hallway, rustling something behind me. I turned. The door to a back room, one I hadn't noticed before, had swung open slightly, like it was inviting me, or warning me. Either way, I knew I had to go in. The door creaked softly as I approached, its hinges stiff from years of silence. Dust drifted through the air in lazy spirals, catching the faint light sneaking through a broken window. Every instinct in me said to turn back, but something deeper, something steady, pushed me forward. I stepped inside. The room was small, almost square, with peeling wallpaper that might once have been cheerful. A few broken chairs lay in a collapsed pile in the corner. But it wasn't the furniture that drew my attention. It was the wall of drawings. Dozens of children's sketches were taped or pinned up, edges curled from age. Crayon suns, stick figures, crooked houses, typical kid drawings. Except for one section. A cluster of papers hung lower on the wall, arranged carefully, deliberately. These weren't colorful. They were done in dark pencil strokes, precise, neat, far too controlled for a child. At the center was a drawing of a boy. Short hair. Thin shoulders. Eyes that seemed too aware, too old. Under it, written in small block letters, Evan. My breath tightened. I leaned closer. Evan's drawings showed things that didn't belong in an orphanage picture wall, scenes of night skies, paths leading to nowhere, pages of symbols and shapes that looked like clues rather than art. And then I saw one drawing that made my heart stumble. A sketch of a classroom. Desks, chalkboard, windows. And at the front? A woman with her hair pulled back into a bun. Mrs. Alden. She looked younger, but unmistakable. She stood with her hands folded, watching the children with that same patient, searching expression she wore years later in my high school classroom. But the strangest part wasn't her. It was the empty seat drawn in the middle row, outlined, labeled faintly. Reserved. Why would a child draw a reserved seat? And why would Evan place it in a room he never sat in, years before Mrs. Alden became a teacher? A shiver worked its way through my spine. Stepped back, scanning the drawings for more answers. And that's when I noticed a small wooden box tucked beneath the wall, similar to the one in her classroom, but older, rougher. My knees bent instinctively, and I reached out. The lid was loose. Inside lay a single folded page, yellow at the edges but uncrumpled, as if carefully protected. I opened it. The handwriting wasn't Mrs. Alden's. The letters were sharp, uneven, written by a child trying hard to stay steady. The message was short. I hope you find this. I hope she keeps her promise. You're going to need the truth when you're older. I'm sorry. Signed simply. Evan. I stared at the page, chills covering my arms. A child in an orphanage, decades ago, had written a message meant for me. My name wasn't in it. But the timing, the notebooks, the letter, the seat labeled reserved. It all pointed to one impossible, unsettling realization. Evan had known I would come long before anyone else did. Behind me, the floorboard groaned. Not from settling. From weight. Footsteps. I turned sharply toward the noise, heart pounding. Someone else was in the orphanage. The footsteps were slow. Careful. Not the skitter of an animal or the snap of a settling floorboard, but the weight of someone human. I froze, breath caught high in my chest. Another step. And another. They came from the hallway outside the small room, each one sending a tight vibration through the old wooden floor. The air felt suddenly colder, like the orphanage itself was bracing. I swallowed hard and stepped away from the drawings, the note from Evan still trembling in my hand. I reached the edge of the doorway and listened. Silence. Then, a voice. Soft. Older. Familiar in a way that made my heart lurch. I hoped you wouldn't come here alone. I turned. A figure stood halfway down the hallway, framed in the dusty slant of afternoon light. Her posture was slightly stooped, her hair streaked with silver, and she leaned gently on a wooden cane. Mrs. Alden. My throat tightened. Mrs. Alden? My voice cracked. How did you? I saw your car outside. She stepped closer, her eyes full of a tired warmth. And when I saw the gate open, I knew exactly where you'd be. There was no anger in her voice. No surprise. Only a deep, heavy sadness. I tried to speak, but my thoughts tangled. Why did you write that letter? I finally asked. How did you know my name? How did a boy I've never met leave a note for me decades before I was born? She let out a long, quiet breath and entered the room. When she glanced at Evan's drawings, something flickered across her face, something like grief. I knew this day would come, she whispered. I just prayed it wouldn't come so soon. She reached out and gently touched one of the sketches, the one with the classroom, the reserved seat drawn carefully in the center. Evan was special, she said. Not in the way people like to romanticize children who suffer, but in a quieter, more complicated way. He saw things before they happened. He understood connections no one else could. You mean, he predicted things? Not predicted, she corrected softly. Recognized. As if he was already living pieces of other people's futures. I felt my pulse quicken. And he recognized me? Her eyes met mine, steady, knowing, impossibly gentle. I didn't believe him at first, she continued. When he told me your name, I thought it was a story he made up to cope with the loneliness here. But he insisted. He said there would be a student I'd meet someday. A student whose life would become tied to his. I swallowed, my voice barely more than air. Tied how? She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked to the back window, gazing out at the overgrown yard as though searching for a memory buried beneath the grass. There's something you need to see, she finally said, her tone breaking slightly. Something I should have shown you years ago. She motioned for me to follow her deeper into the orphanage, down a dim hallway I hadn't explored yet. My feet hesitated. But the look in her eyes told me there was no turning back. Not anymore. Mrs. Alden's footsteps echoed softly as she led me down the narrow hallway. The deeper we went, the darker the air felt, thicker somehow, as if the building itself remembered what we were about to uncover. We stopped at a door at the very end. It was different from the others, metal instead of wood, with a faded number 3C stenciled across the front. A rusted padlock hung from the latch. My heart thumped hard. This room was sealed the day Brookside closed, Mrs. Alden said quietly. No one was allowed back inside. Not the staff, not the children. I glanced at her. Why not? Her eyes flickered with something between fear and guilt. Because this is where Evan spent his final weeks here. The words landed with a weight I wasn't ready for. Before I could ask anything more, she slipped a small key from her coat pocket, one she had clearly kept for decades. Her hands trembled slightly as she unlocked the padlock. The click echoed like a memory breaking open. The door groaned as she pushed it inward. The room was small, almost bare. A narrow bed with rusted metal bars. An old desk with peeling paint. A window boarded from the outside. Time had settled heavily here, dust coating every surface, shadows clinging to the corners like they didn't want to let go. But there was one thing that didn't belong. A cardboard box sat in the center of the room, untouched by dust. Preserved. Waiting. My pulse quickened. Did you put that there? She shook her head slowly. No. Evan did. A chill ran up my spine. But how? You said no one was allowed in after the orphanage closed. Her voice softened. He left it the day before they moved him. He insisted it needed to stay here. He said, she'll know when to come for it. I didn't know who he meant at the time. My breath caught. She. Me. I crouched down in front of the box, hesitating. The cardboard felt strangely warm under my fingers, like it had been touched recently, even though that was impossible. I lifted the lid. Inside were neatly stacked papers, drawings, small objects wrapped in newspaper. But at the very top was a small envelope. My name was written on it. My full name, spelled perfectly. I looked up sharply. Mrs. Alden, how could he know my name? 10 years before I was born? She sank down onto the edge of the bed, her expression tired, almost defeated. That was the question that kept me awake for years, she whispered. But Evan didn't guess. He didn't imagine. He knew. The same way he knew things about the staff, the children, even me. A faint tremor entered her voice. He once told me I'd become a teacher. That I'd meet a student who reminded him of himself. A student I would care for deeply. She paused. He said that student would need my help in ways I couldn't possibly understand yet. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air charged with something unspoken. Very slowly, I opened the envelope. A single line was written inside, in the same uneven handwriting I'd seen on the note in the wooden box. Everything you're looking for begins with the story they never told you. My throat tightened. My fingers trembled. The story who never told me? I whispered. Mrs. Alden looked at me with a softness that held years of hesitation. Your parents. The word hit like a blow. I stared at her, heart pounding, the envelope slipping slightly in my grip. She took a slow breath. There's something they've kept from you your entire life. And it's time you heard it. The room felt colder, as if the walls were listening. I held the envelope so tightly it began to bend. My voice came out cracked, unsure. What do my parents have to do with this? They don't even know this place exists. Mrs. Alden's expression softened with sympathy, deep, aching sympathy, like she had wanted to tell me this years ago but never found the courage. They know, she whispered. More than you think. My pulse quickened. What are you saying? She motioned for me to sit on the old metal bed across from her. The mattress groaned beneath my weight. She took a moment to gather her thoughts, looking toward the boarded window as if searching for the right starting point. Your parents weren't always planning to have a child, she began gently. For a long time, they couldn't. I blinked, surprised. They never told me that. Because the truth was more complicated than infertility, she continued. Your mother, she visited Brookside House once. Many years ago. That hit me like a punch. My mom? She was here? Why? Mrs. Alden clasped her hands together, her knuckles pale. Your mother came to volunteer. She wasn't sure if she even wanted children at that time, but she felt drawn to the stories of kids who had no one. She spent her weekends here, reading to them, helping with chores, comforting the younger ones. I swallowed. I couldn't picture my mother, who loved routines, schedules, predictability, walking through these abandoned halls. And that's when she met Evan. The name filled the room like a cold wind. Evan chose her, she continued softly. He trusted very few people, but with your mother, he opened up. My heartbeat thudded harder with every word. What did he tell her? She hesitated. This is the part your parents never wanted you to know. Her voice lowered. Before he was moved to another facility. Evan told your mother that one day she would have a child. A child who would carry something he couldn't finish. A tremor ran through my chest. He said, she whispered, that the child would someday return here. I felt dizzy. That doesn't make sense. My parents don't believe in anything like that. They didn't, she agreed softly. Not until the day your mother found a note in her purse, one that Evan slipped in without her noticing. My breath hitched. What note? Her eyes filled with regret. A note with your name on it. The world tilted. My name? I whispered. But I wasn't even born. No, she said. You weren't. And that terrified them. I sat back, stunned, feeling the pieces of the story shift violently, rearranging everything I'd ever believed about my life. Your parents convinced themselves it was a coincidence, she said. A silly, creepy child's guess. They buried it. Shut it away. And when you were finally born, they never brought it up again. They wanted you to have a normal life. My throat tightened painfully. But Evan didn't forget you, she said. And neither did I. She nodded slightly toward the cardboard box in front of us. He left all of this for you. He knew you'd come. He knew you'd need it. My hands trembled as I reached into the box, pushing aside the newspaper-wrapped items until I felt something solid, a small wooden frame. I lifted it. Inside the frame was a drawing. A child's drawing. But unmistakable. It was me. My face. My hair. My eyes. My exact childhood look, down to the gap I once had in my front teeth. Drawn by a boy who lived decades before I was born. My breath stalled. Mrs. Alden watched me, her voice barely above a whisper. Now do you understand why I wrote that letter? Why I kept my promise? Why I've dreaded this day for so long? I couldn't speak. Because the world I thought I knew, my parents, my childhood, my identity, was suddenly full of cracks. And through those cracks, something bigger, older, and far more mysterious was beginning to come through. I stared at the drawing, unable to breathe. Every line of it felt alive, as though Evan had reached across time to capture me before I even drew breath in the world. It was impossible. And yet, here it was. Mrs. Alden's voice pulled me from the shock. He saw more than faces, she said softly. He saw the essence of people. He understood things that even grown adults never could. He said you would come to him one day, not in person, but through the story you would carry, the choices you would make. I ran my fingers over the frame, tracing the small pencil marks. Why me? Why would he choose me? She shook her head gently. Not choose. Recognize. He always said the world has patterns, threads that connect people across time. And you, Evan believed, were part of one of those threads. A chill ran down my spine. The walls seemed to hum around us. It wasn't just the orphanage, or the silence, or the dust. It was something larger, almost alive, watching me understand. I looked back at the box. Inside, there were more objects, small, mundane things, a locket, a folded handkerchief, a journal. Items carefully preserved, left as guides. Mrs. Alden nodded. Each one tells a piece of the story. He wanted you to see how connected your life has always been to him. Even before your birth, you were part of a path he mapped out. I opened the journal. The handwriting was shaky, almost childlike, but precise. Page after page detailed Evan's thoughts, observations of the children, and notes about my parents, their visits, their kindness, and most importantly, his vision of the future. It was as if he had been waiting, watching, and preparing for me for decades. I sank onto the floor, overwhelmed. My mind was racing, questions, disbelief, fear, awe, all tangled together. Mrs. Alden knelt beside me. This is why I wrote the letter. I wanted to prepare you, and to give you a chance to understand the truth before you tried to live your life without it. Evan believed you would be able to carry it forward, to make sense of the connections he could only hint at. I swallowed hard. And if I don't? Her hand rested lightly on mine. Then his story, and yours, remains unfinished. But I trust you. I always have. I looked back at the journal, at the drawing, at the carefully preserved objects. The impossible truth settled into me: my life was never random. My existence had been watched, anticipated, and cared for long before I took my first breath. And somewhere deep in my chest, I knew, this was only the beginning of understanding. Night had fully settled outside the orphanage windows, turning the room into a quiet cocoon of soft shadows. I sat with the journal open on my lap, each page revealing something deeper, something heavier, like stepping into a life I didn't know I'd inherited. I flipped to a section marked with a thin ribbon. The first line made my breath catch. For the child who will carry their light forward. My hands trembled. I read slowly. Evan wrote about my parents, not as strangers visiting the orphanage, but as people who spent hours with him every week, people who brought him books, warm meals, little bits of normalcy. They weren't his teachers, they were his only friends. They had promised to help him see the world even when he knew his illness wouldn't allow it. But then, the words shifted. They told me they want a child. They told me they feel something missing. I told them the child they long for will one day read these pages. I froze. My heart hammered so loudly I thought it would echo through the walls. Mrs. Alden watched me quietly, knowing exactly where I was in the journal. Why didn't they tell me this? I whispered. She exhaled slowly. Your parents loved you deeply, but they struggled to have a child. When they finally did, they believed what Evan said wasn't a prophecy, just the imagination of a dying boy. They didn't want to burden you with a story they thought would confuse you. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. But it wasn't just imagination. No, she said softly. It wasn't. I kept reading. If they have their child, I won't meet them. But I know this child will be the bridge. They will connect what was lost. They will finish what I could not. My vision blurred. I blinked fast, trying to steady myself. A dying boy, a boy my parents loved, wrote about me. Not by name, but by fate, by certainty, by a thread he somehow saw long before I existed. And suddenly I realized something that made my stomach drop. Mrs. Alden. Evan wasn't writing about some distant future child by chance. My parents visited him when he was sick. They were trying to adopt before they could have a baby. They would have told him everything, their hopes, their heartbreak. She nodded gently. He wasn't guessing. He was listening. I closed the journal. The air felt different now, heavier with meaning, clearer in purpose. All my life, I'd wondered why I felt drawn to teaching, why certain moments in class felt like déjà vu, why I cared so deeply about the quiet kids, the lonely ones, the dreamers. Maybe I had been living out something planted long before I was born. A path Evan somehow knew I'd walk. A path I was only now beginning to understand. I sat in the fading light, the journal on my lap, my hands still trembling. Each page felt heavier than the last, carrying the weight of a boy who had lived decades before me and yet somehow reached across time to guide my life. I turned to the final entry. The handwriting was shakier here, almost as if Evan had known the end was near. To the child I will never meet in person, but who will carry my story, everything I could not say, everything I could not protect, is in your hands. Do not fear it. Do not doubt it. You are the continuation. My chest tightened. I could almost hear his voice, soft, earnest, and impossibly young. Mrs. Alden knelt beside me. He wanted you to know that life isn't random, she whispered. That the people we love, the connections we make, some of them are planned by forces we can't understand. And sometimes, those forces leave messages for us long before we even exist. I swallowed hard, fighting tears. He wanted me to find this. To understand. But why me? Because, she said, her voice breaking slightly, you were the only one who could carry it forward. You're the child he trusted, the one he believed could finish what he started, the one who could honor him without even knowing it at first. I glanced around the room, the framed drawing, the objects in the box, the sketches on the wall. Every piece felt like a puzzle, a map laid out for me, decades in advance. And then I realized something chilling and beautiful. I wasn't just discovering Evan's story. I was living it. Every choice, every step, every quiet decision I had made had been threaded into this greater tapestry, designed by a boy I never met and a teacher who had waited her entire life to guide me to this moment. Mrs. Alden's hand rested lightly on mine. "It's time for you to go home," she said softly. "And when you do, remember him. Remember all of this. And live your life with the awareness he hoped you would." I nodded, clutching the journal and the letter. My hands shook, but my heart felt steady. I knew that even though Evan had never seen me grow up, his presence had shaped me in ways I would only understand now. As I left Brookside House, the night was quiet. The wind rustled the empty playground, the broken swings moving as though echoing the whispers of the past. And somewhere deep inside, I felt Evan watching, not with eyes, but with hope. The story he began had reached me. And now, it was mine to continue. I walked away from Brookside House under a sky scattered with stars, the notebook and letter pressed tightly to my chest. The air felt alive, filled with whispers of the past, of a boy named Evan who had trusted me before I even existed, and of Mrs. Alden, whose quiet devotion had guided me here. For the first time, I understood what it meant to be part of something larger than myself, a story spanning decades, woven through lives I had never known. I felt a strange comfort knowing that someone had seen me, even before I drew my first breath, and had prepared a path just for me to follow. When I reached my car, I paused. I looked back at the dark silhouette of Brookside House. The shadows no longer seemed heavy or empty. They felt sacred, full of memory and care, full of hope that had been passed down through time. Driving home, I thought about my parents, their love, their quiet secrets, and the ways their lives had intersected with Evan's. I thought about Mrs. Alden, who had waited decades to fulfill her promise. And I thought about Evan, whose life had ended too soon, yet had left a bridge for me to walk across. The world felt larger now, layered with connections I couldn't have imagined. And I understood that life wasn't just about the years we lived, but about the stories we inherited, the threads we follow, and the ones we leave behind. I reached my front door, taking a deep breath, feeling a strange mix of grief, awe, and gratitude. I knew I would carry this story with me forever, not as a burden, but as a gift. And as I stepped inside, I whispered quietly, "Thank you, Evan. I'll carry your story forward." Thank you so much for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel for more emotional and mysterious tales, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. I'd love to hear how the story made you feel. Your support helps the channel grow, and there are many more secrets and stories waiting to be discovered. Thank you again, and see you in the next story.